As we begin today's hearing, I invite you to support the channel. Please subscribe, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from.
I remember that morning as clearly as if it happened yesterday, not because of the weather or the docket, but because of the way one man crossed the threshold of my courtroom. The forecast had promised rain, so people came in with hoods up and umbrellas dripping, shaking water off their shoes before they sat. There was that low hum you always hear before session starts, quiet conversations, rustling papers, someone coughing in the back. But when my clerk called his name, the sound in the room thinned out, like someone had turned down the volume. He was a politician. I'd seen him on local television more than once. Mid-40s, maybe edging toward 50. Dark suit that fit a little too perfectly, bright tie with a little pin that caught the light just enough to make you look twice. He wore a soft, practiced smile, the kind that says, "I've been in a lot of rooms, and they usually go my way." He didn't come in alone. 2 aides shadowed him. One slipped the coat off his shoulders before he reached the front row. The other pressed a folder into his hand like a prop being handed to an actor right before his cue. He walked down the aisle as if he'd walked it 100 times and never once had to answer for anything. On his way past the clerk's desk, he leaned in just enough for her and for me to hear. "Let's keep this quick. Busy morning in the Capitol." It was said lightly, almost as a joke. But jokes have a way of revealing what a man really thinks. I had just reviewed his file. Technically, he was there for a parking violation. He had left his car in a space reserved for city emergency services during a municipal meeting. On paper, it was small. But I already knew that because of that choice, a repair crew had been delayed getting to a call. Delays have faces, not just timestamps. He stepped up to the podium and did something I noticed right away. He kept his city council badge pinned to his jacket. Most people take anything official off when they stand before a judge. He didn't. If anything, he squared his shoulders so the logo was easier to see. One of his aides moved as if to unclip it, maybe out of habit. The politician brushed his hand away with a small, almost gentle gesture. It wasn't rough, but it was clear. "Leave it. I want it seen." From the bench, I thought, he didn't just come here to respond to a summons. He came to remind everyone who he is. When he opened the folder to glance at the citation, I saw at the slightest tremor in his index finger. A quick, shallow breath followed it. Not the shaky fear of a man who thinks he's going to jail. It was the tension of someone who is used to controlling every room he walks into and sensing that this one might not bend as easily. In all my years on the bench, I've learned this much. The louder a man leans on his status, the softer the spot he's trying to cover. I had wondered, even before he walked in, why this case had landed on my desk instead of being handled quietly by the usual traffic court rotation. Parking violations by public officials happen more often than people like to admit, and most of them resolve without ever reaching my bench. But this one carried weight the moment I opened the file. He had parked in a zone reserved strictly for municipal emergency response teams, crews who fix gas leaks, restore power after storms, secure hazardous sites, the kind of workers most people never think about until they desperately need them. His car, left sitting there during a city committee meeting, forced a team to reroute and delayed their arrival to a broken water main. It wasn't catastrophic, but it mattered. As my father used to say, a delay might not burn a house down, but it'll soak someone's life in the meantime. This wasn't just about a car. It was about the idea that some people think their schedule outweighs everyone else's safety. When I dug into his history, the picture sharpened. This wasn't his first time, nor his second. In the span of 14 months, the same politician had received 5 separate warnings for parking in restricted municipal zones. 5. And he had never once shown up to court, not once. An aide came. A written statement came. A polite note from his office came, always explaining, never apologizing. A pattern isn't built in a day. It's built in habits a person no longer notices. The night before the hearing, someone from City Hall, an old acquaintance of mine, called with a tone halfway between courtesy and caution. "Frank, just giving you a heads up. He's sensitive about public criticism, and he's, well, you know, influential." I did know. Influence in my city travels quickly, like sound waves bouncing off narrow streets. But influence is not a key that opens every door, especially not the one behind my bench. "I understand," I told him, "but in my courtroom he's a citizen before he's anything else." Still, the call lingered with me in a way I wish it hadn't. When power tries to walk ahead of a person into a courtroom, it casts a shadow that everyone can feel. So when he finally stood before me, and I asked him the standard clarifying questions, name, address, purpose of visit, I was prepared for his polished answers. But something in his tone shifted. The casual charm he'd worn on his way in tightened into something stiffer. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "My name is..." Too formal, too precise. His voice dipped half an octave lower. People who are truly confident speak naturally. People who anticipate resistance rehearse. His shoulders pulled inward just a fraction as he answered. It was quick, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there, the first crack in the mask. Behind him, one of his aides stood with the rigid posture of someone trying not to react. The other kept tapping a foot lightly, eyes darting between me and the gallery, like he feared this performance wasn't going the way they had rehearsed it in the hallway. I watched the politician carefully. His jaw tightened between responses, his hands, resting on the podium, pressed just a little too flat, as if trying to anchor himself. He wasn't the same man who joked with my clerk moments earlier, and I thought something or someone had told him this hearing wasn't a formality. He recognized, maybe for the first time, that this room didn't run on influence or courtesy calls. It ran on accountability, and accountability, for a man who'd avoided it for years, can be far more intimidating than any penalty written in a code book. I asked him to explain, in his own words, why he had parked where he did. It's a simple question, but simple questions reveal far more than complicated ones. They leave less room to hide. He straightened his tie, a gesture too careful to be casual, and said, "I was instructed by a city employee to use that space. It wasn't an unauthorized decision." He said it smoothly, like a line polished in a hallway. But as soon as the sentence left his mouth, he seemed to realize it didn't quite cover the ground he needed it to. So he added, almost hurriedly, "And the signage, it's not always very clear in that area. Two narratives, two defenses, and neither of them fit together." People in the courtroom exchanged quiet glances. You could feel a small shift, like the collective tilt of a room realizing the story had a wobble in it. The aides behind him stiffened. One glanced down, the other pressed his lips together as if holding back an instinct to step in and rescue him. I've spent decades watching bodies speak, even when mouths don't. His hands told a different story. He picked up a pen from the podium, rolled it between his fingers, put it down, picked it up again. The repetition gave away what his words tried to conceal. So I opened the evidence packet. The first photo showed the sign new, bright, unmistakable. The second showed the curb, painted a vivid yellow that even the weakest pair of eyes could catch. And the third showed his car pulled directly in front of the sign, positioned in a way that suggested convenience, not confusion. When I set the photos on the bench, I didn't have to say anything. The stillness in the room spoke for me, the kind of stillness that makes a man feel the weight of his own words. The politician's face didn't redden, he was too experienced for that. But the muscles around his mouth tightened, just briefly, like a man biting down on his own frustration. His eyes flicked toward the photos, then back at me, then toward the gallery, searching for something, an ally, a nod, any sign that the narrative he'd offered was holding together. It wasn't. I turned to the officer who had issued the citation. "Officer, did anyone on the defendant's staff receive prior warnings about this designated space?" The officer clasped his hands behind his back. His voice was steady, factual, not hostile, just precise. "Yes, Your Honor, 3 times. Each time we notified his aides directly. The space is for emergency technicians only, no exceptions." The politician's jaw moved slightly, a small clench that pulsed under the skin. In that moment, the tone of the room changed. Not dramatically, there were no gasps or raised voices, but in the quiet way people settle into knowing that the truth is leaning heavily in one direction. He tried to recover. "I may have misunderstood the instructions," he said, lowering his voice. It was the first honest-sounding thing he'd said all morning, and it landed differently. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It sounded like the beginning of a man seeing the edges of his own story. He looked down for a moment, just long enough to suggest he was weighing something: responsibility, perhaps, or the realization that this time would not be solved with a quick phone call afterward. The gallery responded in its own subtle way. A woman in the front row folded her hands in her lap more tightly. A man 2 benches back leaned forward slightly, not in anger but in interest, the way people do when they sense someone approaching a crossroads. And the aides behind him? One shifted his weight to his other foot. The other exhaled through his nose, quiet but noticeable, as though bracing for impact. Then came the question that truly broke the veneer. "Sir," I said gently, "are you stating that your staff received 3 warnings and failed to convey them to you? Or are you suggesting the sign was unclear despite the photographs?" His eyes darted to the photos again. The tremor in his hand returned, not dramatic, barely a flick, but enough to register as the truth wrestling its way to the surface. For a moment, he didn't answer. Not because he lacked words, but because he didn't know which version of himself he was supposed to be, now the confident official who walked in with a smile, or the man standing before evidence he could not bend. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened, the public polish scraped thin. "I might have overlooked some things." It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was the closest he had ever come, and I thought this was the first real crack in the armor, not forced, not strategic, just a man beginning to understand that the room he thought he could command was asking him, at last, to listen. I had just asked him one more clarifying question, nothing difficult, nothing meant to corner him, when he suddenly broke through the thin layer of composure he'd been balancing on. "Your Honor, rules are flexible. We all know that." It landed in the room like a dropped piece of iron. The hum of quiet breathing froze. Someone in the back clicked a pen twice, loudly, before catching themselves. His words weren't careless, they were revealing. They came from a worldview built over years, maybe decades, a belief that rules were suggestions for most people and negotiable for people like him. And I remember thinking, there it is, not the parking violation, not the excuse, the philosophy. I raised my eyebrows slowly, not theatrically. "Not in this courtroom, sir." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Sometimes calmness becomes its own kind of boundary, and he felt it. His foot shifted backward half an inch. No more, but it was the movement of someone who had expected a door to open and found it locked. Inside, I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me, power is loud, respect is quiet, and this man had confused the two for far too long. The room changed around him. His aide, the taller one, stopped taking notes mid-sentence. The other straightened his jacket as if bracing for an impact. The officer folded his arms, not confrontational, simply ready. And the public gallery leaned forward just slightly, like an audience that sensed the play had shifted into a different act. Then a woman in the third row raised her hand. She had been quiet the whole time, a plain blouse, tired eyes, the look of someone who'd worked the early shift somewhere that didn't have heated offices or polished floors. She wasn't on the witness list, but something in her expression made me nod. She stood only halfway and said, with a voice that shook at the beginning but found steadiness by the second sentence, "Judge, my son works in emergency repair. That day they got to a gas leak late. They couldn't get the truck out of the lot because someone was in their spot. No accusation, no anger, just the simple, aching truth of someone who has watched her child race toward danger for a living." Her words slid into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved through every face in the room. The politician's reaction was small, but unmistakable. His shoulders dipped, his eyes blinked faster. A hint of color rose on his neck. It was the look of a man suddenly aware that consequences have names and families, not just paperwork. And then, like a man grabbing at the air to stop a fall, he tried to speak. "Ma'am, I'm sure that had nothing to do with..." But the sentence broke in the middle, not from fury, from fear. Fear of losing the image he'd built. Fear of the room seeing him, not the politician, not the polished speaker, but the flawed, hurried man who cut corners because they were convenient. He swallowed hard and went silent. For the first time all morning, the mask slipped completely. This wasn't the confident public figure who walked in with a smile and a badge. This was someone staring at the truth he could no longer steer. And I thought, now we can finally begin the real conversation. After the woman sat down, I turned to the officer. "Let's review the documented impact of the delay," I said, not for theatrics, but because clarity is often the only antidote to confusion, real or convenient. The officer approached with a measured steadiness. He opened his folder and laid out a simple timeline. The emergency crew should have left the lot at 11:03. They pulled out at 11:14, 11 minutes. Long enough for a gas leak to spread, long enough for a frightened resident to call twice instead of once. Then he played a short clip from his body camera. You could hear the dispatcher's voice, strained but controlled. We're delayed again. Same spot blocked. No commentary, no raised voices, just the clean, cold sound of reality doing what reality always does, quietly contradicting wishful thinking. The camera panned past the lot entrance, and there it was, the politician's sedan, stationed directly under the service-only sign, the kind of proof even he couldn't talk around. I watched him instead of the screen. He didn't flinch, not dramatically, but something inside him settled in a way that wasn't comfortable. His fingers flexed once against the podium, then stopped moving at all. His jaw loosened not from ease, but from the exhaustion of holding up a version of events that no longer stood. When the video ended, the room stayed silent long enough for the truth to sink in fully. And then, in a tone stripped of spin, stripped of confidence, stripped of all the practiced charm he walked in with, he said quietly, "I didn't know people were affected. I thought it was just a spot, a minute or two." It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even an explanation. It was the closest thing to honesty he had offered all morning. The woman who had spoken earlier leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Judge, for letting us speak." Her gratitude transformed the room. The tension softened, not into sympathy, but into something more human, a recognition that justice isn't about punishment alone, it's about being heard. I felt that shift. I felt it before, and I thought, this is where accountability becomes understanding. Then the politician spoke again, and this time his voice trembled at the edges, the way a voice does when a man is finally admitting something to himself. "My schedule is overwhelming. I cut corners. Too many." The aides behind him looked down, one at his shoes, the other at the floor, as if recognizing a truth they'd been living with far longer than I had. It wasn't arrogance that had driven him, at least not solely. It was speed, pressure, a life built on always being somewhere else, doing something else, too busy to consider who had to bend for him. And there it was, the human layer beneath the title, a man not malicious, but careless, not cruel, but blind to the cost of convenience. When all was said, I delivered the ruling. "Sir, the fines for all violations will stand in full. Additionally, you will attend a mandatory session with the city's emergency response unit. You will observe their work, their timing, and the impact that access or lack of access has on public safety." It wasn't harsh. It wasn't lenient. It was proportional. He nodded once. No argument, no resistance, just a quiet acceptance that carried more weight than any speech he could have given. As he stepped back from the podium, the gallery stayed still, watching not a politician, but a man beginning to understand the shape of the consequences he had never bothered to look at before. And I thought, sometimes the truth doesn't break people, it wakes them up. When I announced the ruling, he didn't reach for his badge, didn't look toward his aides, didn't try to reclaim the authority that had carried him into the room. He simply stood there, both hands resting lightly on the podium, as if feeling the weight of it for the first time. "Understood, Your Honor," he said. No embellishment, no argument, just a quiet acknowledgement of the ruling, of the consequences, of the truth he had spent the morning circling. His aides stayed behind him, unusually still. One folded his notes without a word, the other avoided eye contact entirely, staring at the grain of the courtroom floor. There are moments when the people around you reveal more about your journey than anything you say. This was one of those moments. The gallery remained silent until he stepped away from the podium. Then something subtle happened. People breathed out, not in relief for themselves, but in a shared understanding that something meaningful, something honest, had taken place. The mother of the emergency worker dabbed at the corner of her eye, not out of sadness, out of release. That is a look I've seen many times. The small, grateful exhale when someone who often goes unseen is finally acknowledged. Court adjourned. Life went on. But certain cases don't end when the gavel falls. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten note from the chief of the emergency repair team. It was short, almost abrupt in its plainness. He came. He asked questions. He stayed longer than we scheduled. He wanted to understand. I read it twice. Then I set it on the corner of my desk and left it there for the rest of the week. Not because of who wrote it, but because of what it meant. The true measure of accountability isn't the penalty. It's the time a person chooses to give afterward. Months passed. Seasons turned. And then one morning, tucked between routine letters and municipal reports, I found a small envelope with no return seal. Inside was a single line written in careful handwriting. Judge, rules shouldn't be flexible, but people can be. Thank you for helping me realize that. No title, no office insignia, just a man speaking plainly, maybe for the first time in a long time. A few days later, the woman from the gallery, the mother of the emergency worker, appeared in my courtroom again on an entirely different matter. She wasn't emotional this time. She wasn't even nervous. As she walked out, she paused by my bench just long enough to say quietly, "You did right by him, Judge. He needed that day." Then she left, and the courtroom settled back into its familiar rhythm, papers shuffling, shoes on old wood, the echoes of ordinary disputes. But her words stayed with me. They reminded me that justice isn't always a sharp instrument. Sometimes it's a soft one, and sometimes it lands not on the person you're judging, but on the people watching, those who need to see that fairness still has a place in the world. I sat there for a moment longer, thinking of my father, a man who never had power but understood it better than most who do. He used to tell me, "Frankie, the real strength of a person isn't tested when everything goes right. It's tested when he's asked to slow down and really see who his actions touch." And so I ended that day the only way I knew how, with the lesson that has carried me through decades on the bench. Justice isn't about the rules we enforce, it's about the lives we remember while enforcing them.